The next speaker is Steven Nitah. Steven was born in Yellowknife and raised around the Lutzel K'e in Northwest Territories. He grew up with and learned from a generation of people who were not subject to residential schools and lived life in the traditional Nene way in balance with nature. Steven's education includes Trent University and the Arctic College Native Studies program. Steven has worked as associate producer for the program Nene with CBC North TV in Yellowknife, worked at the Dievac Diamond Mines as a company liaison for northern governments and communities, and in 1999 was elected to the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly as a representative for 2 Nene riding. He then became the president and CEO of the Denisoline Corporation. Steven was elected chief of the Lutzel K'e Dene First Nation in 2008. In that role, he brought his community to the table with the Government of Canada, then led his team in negotiating the establishment agreements to create Thaidene National Park Reserve, a territorial, protected, and conserved area in partnership with Parks Canada and the Government of Northwest Territories. In his role as an advisor to the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, Steven was a member of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, set up to advise the government on the pathway to Target 1, producing the report and recommendations titled We Rise Together, after significant engagement with Indigenous peoples in Canada on the creation, governance, and management of new protected areas. The Indigenous Leadership Initiative is working with their Indigenous government partners in advancing IPCAs across Canada and as an anchor partner in the Conservation Through Reconciliation, which is a 7-year SSHRC-sponsored research project to support the implementation of the Indigenous Circles of Experts recommendations. Steven is a member of that leadership team. He's a very busy guy. Steven has devoted his working life to the rights and responsibilities of Indigenous peoples to their territories, communities, and families. He has a deep commitment to biodiversity, the services that nature provides, and the essential role of Indigenous leadership in environmental management, including conservation and climate change. Steven?
Thank you, Risa, for that wonderful introduction. Steven Nitah Sulye, Susik Indigenous-led. Don't say, Nutsine Masi, Helesi, Ayuatha, Nuni Lasi. My name is Steven Nitah. I'm from Tsutsige. I thank the Creator today. And in my language, when we say the Creator, we say Nutsine. Nutsine means the person or the entity that created Mother Earth. We call Mother Earth Nu. In my language, Nu means the island. So my people, Indigenous people, recognize the Earth early on as an island within the sea of space. And we've managed our relationship with the island as such. If you go in any of the Great Lakes or in the oceans in this world, you end up on an island. You have a finite resource, and you have to manage yourself accordingly. And that's the challenge we have today. I'm going to be reading from a presentation which I normally don't do because there's a number of numbers that I want to share with you. I'd like to also thank the group that brought us together today. This event is so important. You have brought us together to talk about something vitally important, why nature-based solutions matters for a shared future. We are in an urgent time, ladies and gentlemen. From scientific studies to the lived experience of people in the North, we know climate change is intensifying. Families, communities, entire species are feeling the brunt. Combating the crisis requires using all the tools at our disposal. It also brings us opportunity. Nature-based solutions don't just fend off crisis, they create opportunities to recognize Indigenous leadership, opportunities to advance reconciliation, opportunities to conserve more lands and sustain more biodiversity, opportunities to make Canada a leader on the global stage. But it requires relationship. These opportunities open the door for a new way of relating to Mother Earth. While we live in a consumerism society, we buy stuff we don't need, make stuff that's disposable. It's stretching the resources coming out of Mother Earth, and it's clogging up the rivers and oceans. Mother Earth is not feeling well, and we are the cause. It comes down to the view that land is to be utilized. Since Europeans arrived on these shores, the dominant approach to the natural world has been one of exploitation. Think of the phrase land use planning, land use, how we use the land. It doesn't talk about land relationship planning. Some of the things we need to start thinking about is how we use our language and how we should review the use of the language so that it's not damaging to the earth, to the natural world, and to ourselves. It's about how we are going to develop this piece of land, how we are going to access the resources, how do we give the land economic value. Those are things that we teach ourselves in our education institutions. We use catchphrases like sustainable development. If you really think about that term, what we are saying is that we are okay with life on the edge when we should be managing for abundance, as the Indigenous people have done for thousands of years. Indigenous cultures offer another approach. When Indigenous peoples talk about land, we are not talking about a commodity. We are talking about a living system that inspires respect. We are talking about relationship. Elders tell us, take care of the land, and the land takes care of you. It is a connection built on reciprocity and responsibility. That approach works. Indigenous people today manage about 25% of the world's land and support about 80% of the biodiversity left on the planet. Think about that. 5% of the world's population controlling or influencing 25% of the world's landmass that has 80% of the biodiversity left. Tell me who's showing leadership. That's why today, more than ever, we need land relationship plans. We need to redo land use plans. We need to rebuild those plans as the land relationship plans. And give the Indigenous peoples the pen. Because if you give the Indigenous people the pen in land use plans, 60% of those land use plans or that land relationship plans is focused on conservation. And Indigenous nations can offer guidance because if we want to sustain the rest of the world's biodiversity and support nature-based climate solutions, we must manage for abundance, and we must respect the proven Indigenous leadership of the land. Here in Canada, the biggest, most ambitious plans for conserving lands are coming from Indigenous nations. Indigenous peoples have the expertise, we have the proven models, and we have the cultural responsibility for stewardship. We can help respond to environmental crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss. Supporting Indigenous leadership is the most effective way for Canada to meet its international conservation commitments in 2020 and beyond. This gives me hope that we do walk down this road. The possibility keeps me hopeful. The trend lines for climate change and biodiversity loss are daunting, but I am inspired by the leadership of Indigenous people in turning the tide and the partnerships we have formed with Crown governments. If we continue down the road we have started, the one where we work together as public and Indigenous governments on conservations in the spirit of reconciliation, we can improve the future for our children, our nations, our world. Indigenous nations are helping show the way. One of the fundamental principles of nature-based climate solutions is maintaining healthy, intact lands. It's a matter of prevention versus repairing. and after the damage has been done. Think of the boreal forest. I call it the emerald necklace, covering most of the northern hemisphere. It is the largest intact forest left on the planet, and it connects all provinces and territories in Canada. It holds 25% of the world's wetlands. It also stores about 12% of the world's land-based carbon reserves. That's the equivalent of 34 years of global greenhouse gas emissions from smokestacks and tailpipes. About 95% of the boreal's carbon riches in soil, peatlands, and permafrost, features that can accumulate and hold carbon over the course of thousands of years. The amount of carbon buried deep below the boreal surface is roughly equivalent to at least 70 years of annual emissions from China. When industrial projects dig deep into soil and muskeg, they can release 1,000-year-old carbon reservoirs into atmosphere in bursts. Conserving the boreal keeps these carbon riches in place and help protect against the threat of unchecked climate change. The boreal forest is also home to over 600 Indigenous communities, and many Indigenous nations across the boreal are ensuring most of these lands remain intact. Research confirms that Indigenous people continue to maintain lands and their biodiversity and carbon storing values. The United Nations Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services found that more than 1 million plants and animal species are facing extinction. Yet the report also identified an important bright spot. Lands and waters managed by Indigenous people tend to be healthier and more vibrant. A recent University of British Columbia study had similar findings. Researchers looked at land and species data from Canada, Australia, and Brazil and found that the number of birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles were highest on lands managed by Indigenous peoples. Indigenous stewardship works because it honors the relationship between people and the land. It recognizes that caribou herds, salmon runs, and songbird nesting grounds benefit from the respectful management. We speak for those living entities, those living species that can't speak for themselves. Indigenous people have taken on that role. In Indigenous communities, the management is guided by Indigenous law, which are based on natural law. Generations of traditional knowledge and cultural responsibility. This isn't about drawing lines on map, removing the people and locking away the land. It's about putting people back in the picture. It's about sustaining the relationship and the responsibility that connects the health of the people to the health of the land. As part of honoring the responsibility to lands, many Indigenous nations are identifying lands to protect. These lands tend to be rich in carbon-rich soils, wetlands, and permafrost. In fact, the largest protected areas created since Canada laid out its plan in Target 1 have been led by Indigenous nations. I'm proud to say my nation is one of them. In partnership with Crown governments, both Canada and the Government of Northwest Territories, we have protected over 26,000 square kilometers of land and inland waters, using our collective resources and knowledge systems. These collective knowledge systems will be used to govern, manage, and operate Thaidene and Nene together. Why the community wanted to conserve it? Like many other Indigenous nations across the country, our prophecies tells us that we need to do this. Indigenous nations across the country have them as well. And taking a leadership role, small Indigenous nations across the country are preparing their territories to accommodate climate refugees. Not too often you see science and Indigenous prophecies align. They are aligning, and we're in trouble. Many more IPCAs are proposed. When the call went out from Nature Fund for creating new protected areas, dozens of Indigenous nations responded with proposals to establish Indigenous protected or conserved areas. Last summer, Canada announced funding for more than 60 projects under the Canada Nature Fund, Almost 30 were for indigenous protected and conserved areas. These funds were matched by non-governmental organizations. That's a great commitment, and I think we should acknowledge the non-governmental organizations for contributing to that nature fund and to the creation of new protected areas in this country with an applause this morning. These 30 projects are just the tipping point of the iceberg. There is a lot more interest out there. I know for a fact because as Indigenous Leadership Initiative, we're partners with 23 of the successful applicants, but we have many more partners that want to create Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Canada will need to increase its investment in these and many other IPCA proposals, while also supporting the Indigenous Guardians necessary to care for them, if it hopes to meet its ambitious goals on conservation and climate change. The Thaidene of Manitoba, for instance, are looking at protecting the Seal River watershed, an area of 55,000 square kilometers. The Thaidene government of Nene are proposing IPCAs that will conserve over 100,000 square kilometers of boreal forest within their newly established biosphere. These lands store an enormous amount of carbon, the equivalent of almost 35 years of Canada's annual greenhouse gas emissions. The Cascadene proposed protected area, for instance, spans 40,000 square kilometers of headwater lakes and boreal forests in northern British Columbia. And the Innu Nation plan to conserve 20,000 square kilometers of caribou grounds and wild salmon runs in Labrador. The 23 partnerships that Indigenous leadership and our partners are supporting represent over 300,000 square kilometers of conservation areas. That's leadership, ladies and gentlemen. And we take our example from Australia. Australia shows us the possibilities. Progress in building across Canada, and how now Canada can learn from a powerful model. Australia shows what can be achieved when governments make sustained investments in Indigenous-led conservation. For over 20 years, Australia has invested in IPAs. Multiple governments have sustained the support and continues to deliver results. There are 75 IPAs in Australia, covering over 68 million hectares of land and sea. They account for nearly half of the national system of parks and conserved lands. IPAs are managed by Indigenous rangers who monitor wildlife, manage wildfires, address climate impacts, and maintain tourist and cultural sites. Research shows that ranger programs have transformative impacts on families and communities, offering professional training, a sense of purpose, and cultural connection. The Australian government recognizes that the protected areas require ongoing management, and so it has invested 840 million Canadian in the Indigenous Rangers program from 2007 to 2023. These investments do more than protect lands and waters. They also rebuild communities. Researchers found that for every dollar invested in integrated ranger and IPA programs can generate up to $3 in social, economic, and cultural benefits, including reduced income support, improved health, and lower justice costs. This is an investment, and it saves taxpayers money. Indigenous Guardians, like the Australian model, recognizes and protected areas and require ongoing management. Here in Canada, Indigenous Guardians provide an ongoing stewardship. What do Guardians do? Guardians serve as the ears and eyes of the people on the land. They represent their communities, and it gives their communities peace of mind in working with Crown governments, industry, and conservation organizations. They are trained experts to manage protected areas, restore animals and plants, test water quality, and monitor development. They also connect youth and elders and maintain cultural sites. and they draw on Indigenous and Western knowledge systems to do their work. Response to fire. Fire is going to be a big challenge in the climate crisis that we live in today. Australia is a good example. We see that today in Australia. On-the-ground management is essential for responding to climate impacts, especially fire. Estimates vary, but some experts say wildfires account for up to 20% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. This is increasing and may reach 30% in the coming decades. Yet current global carbon accounting rules treat emissions from forest fires in Canada as if they do not exist, although these impacts account for, on average, approximately 25% of Canada's total contributions to the global carbon crisis. Moreover, addressing the growing threats of forest fires in Canada may be a cost-effective way to achieve real reduction in Canada's actual emissions. We need more research to address the carbon impacts of wildfires, but Indigenous Guardians could play an instrumental role in that effort. Scientists increasingly agree Indigenous knowledge built over millennia will help navigate the new era of supercharged fires. We've seen in Australia, in the wake of the devastating fires, Indigenous rangers view fires as a tool, and they use it to reduce underbrush that fuels more intense bushfires. Aboriginal people know the land, they know how to time burns based on moisture levels, growth of plants, and wind conditions. This approach works. Devastating bushfires have been cut in half on the mostly Aboriginal lands of northern Australia in the past 10 years. Guardians and climate impacts in Canada. A similar approach could apply in Canada. Climate change is expected to create drier conditions in the western boreal forests, increasing the risk of devastating blazes. Many Indigenous nations are within forests more likely to burn as a result of climate change. Like in Australia, Indigenous people have expertise that can reduce fire risk and other climate impacts. About 60 Indigenous Guardians program help manage traditional territories across the country today. We are hoping that all 600 plus nations have their own Guardians programs. And these places are in places, especially in the northern part of the country, where it's very difficult to create employment. It's either industrial development or poverty. Guardians provide an opportunity to create employment opportunities in very difficult places where employment opportunities can be created. They can provide rapid response to fires. Guardians are on the land every day and spot new burns before they get out of control. They know the terrain and how flames will move. They know which elders are in the bush and which elders need help. With added investment, Indigenous Guardians can respond to increasingly unpredictable fires. I used to be a firefighter as a young guy. I used to jump out into sloughs with chains over my head to cut chopper pads. So I got personal experience in fighting fires. Other exciting Indigenous-led initiatives are through academia. As a member of the ICE report, we made solid recommendations. The Indigenous Circle of Experts were not just members of Indigenous communities. We had representatives from the federal government, departments, different provinces and territories. Every recommendation in the ICE report was negotiated and passed the bureaucratic sniff test. So every one of those recommendations is implementable. And a group of us created a SHRC-sponsored 7-year research project that we coined Conservation Through Reconciliation. We are there to support the implementation of the ICE report and to support and capacitate Indigenous nations across the country as they create their own Indigenous protected or conserved areas. In the short term, And we have about 30 partners, and many organizations and government departments in this room are partners. We are hoping to not only share Indigenous knowledge, but transfer that knowledge so that it's owned in a corporate way by your guys' organizations. But at the same time, we want to be able to start infusing that knowledge system into our educational institutions from K to 12 and at the university level. We need a transformational change. We can't just protect land and expect things are going to stay the same. We could protect all the land we want today. Climate change is not going to stop. We need to change the way we relate to and how we live with Mother Earth. We've designed our economies and our education system to support our economies, which is based on exploitation. So, the conservation through reconciliation, my friend Norma Cassie from the Yukon, they've got a Canadian Mountain Network that they're another 4 years of Indigenous-led research projects. There's a gathering called Reconciling Ways of Knowing that's scheduled for May in Winnipeg, where Indigenous thought leaders are meeting with scientific thought leaders, and through ethical space, they want to weave that knowledge systems together to create two-eyed seeing, using the best of both knowledge systems so we could use that knowledge system to manage lands as we create protected areas, as we develop lands, as we manage waters. And they need support. Every one of you guys should consider looking at that, at supporting that gathering and future gatherings like that. We need to combine the best of our knowledge systems and create a new paradigm in how we work with each other and how we work with Mother Earth. In conclusion, Indigenous knowledge of the land developed over a course of thousands of years holds a key for unlocking the challenge of fire, species extinction, and other global environmental challenges. It's about relationships between people and the land, and between Indigenous and non-Indigenous nations. We are stronger when we work together, when we draw from our diverse knowledge systems, when Indigenous science is respected alongside Western science. Around the world, Indigenous defenders are being killed for their work on behalf of Mother Earth. Canada can offer a profoundly important alternative, a shining beacon. By supporting Indigenous stewardship, Canada can show that nature-based climate solutions and biodiversity preservation can only be achieved in partnership with Indigenous peoples. This is the core of how Canada can meet its international commitments. And this is the heart of building a better relationship with the land and with each other. Masicho.